He let the fire die on purpose. That is the part no one ever understood about Caleb Rourke, not his neighbors, not the men at the feed store who still tipped their hats when they saw him coming, not even the preacher who had stopped riding out to check on him after the second winter. Caleb had not forgotten how to build a fire. He had simply decided that warmth was something he no longer deserved. 3 years, 3 winters, and every Christmas Eve, he sat in the dark and let the cold come, in the same way it had come for them, slow at first, then all at once, then permanent. He was not a villain. He was just a man who had made grief into a discipline. And then someone pounded on his door, so hard the frame shook. If you've ever wondered what it would take to reach a man who has already decided to disappear, stay with us. Because what happened next on that mountain changed everything. Before we go further, if stories like this one speak to something in you, something real and human, take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button. And drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from, because I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that door. The knock came at 11 minutes past 9 on Christmas Eve. Caleb knew the time because the clock on the mantle was the last thing in the house still working, still keeping its promise, still doing what it was built to do. He had let everything else go. The second horse sold off in the fall. The kitchen garden gone to weeds since June. The spare bedroom door kept shut because he could not walk past it without his chest doing something he could not name. But the clock ticked. He did not know why. He kept winding it. Maybe because stopping it felt like one more surrender, and he had already surrendered enough. He was sitting in the one chair he still used, closest to the fireplace that held nothing but cold ash. He had a blanket over his legs. He had a half-empty bottle of rye on the floor beside him. He was not drunk. He had never been a man who could lose himself in whiskey the way some men could, and he had tried. Those first months, he had genuinely tried, but the liquor just made everything sharper. So he drank enough to feel the edge of it and no more. Outside, the blizzard had been going since mid-afternoon. He had watched it come in from the north, watched it swallow the tree line, watched it turn the sky the color of old pewter. He had not been concerned. He had enough wood stacked on the porch to last 3 weeks. He had simply chosen not to use it. The knock came again. 3 hard blows, then a pause, then 2 more. Desperate rhythm. The kind of knocking that was not asking for something, it was begging. Caleb did not move. He told himself it was an animal. A branch knocked loose by wind. The barn door working itself off its second hinge the way it had been threatening to do since October. He told himself all of this with the careful patience of a man who has had a lot of practice not answering things that call to him in the dark. Then he heard the voice. It was a woman. He could not make out the words, but the tone cut through the wind and the walls and the thick silence of the house, the way certain sounds do, the way a child crying can travel a quarter mile and still arrive whole. She was not screaming. That was what stopped him. She was saying something in a low, pressed-tight voice. The voice of someone who has run out of panic and is now operating on whatever comes after panic, which is something colder and more dangerous than fear. He got up. He did not want to. He sat in the chair for another 20 seconds, telling himself to stay seated, and then his body made a different decision than his mind. And he was standing, and then he was walking, and then he was at the door with his hand on the bolt, and he could hear, clearly now, a woman saying, "Stay awake. Stay with me, someone's here. Stay awake, baby." He opened the door. The cold hit him first, the way it always does in that country, not like a wind, but like a wall, like the mountain itself pressing its palm against your chest. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw them. A woman, probably in her late 20s, dark hair plastered to her face, wearing a coat that was not built for this weather. Behind her, half sheltered by her body, 2 girls, 1, maybe 10, 1, maybe 7 huddled, together, their arms locked around each other, both shaking visibly even from where Caleb stood. The taller girl had her eyes open. The shorter one did not. And in the woman's arms, pressed against her chest, a small child. 3, maybe 4 years old. So pale she looked like something carved from soap. Not shaking, just still. Caleb's stomach dropped straight through the floor. The woman looked up at him. Her eyes were brown and completely without hope, not the kind of hopelessness that comes from giving up, but the specific kind that comes from having done everything right and watching it fail anyway. "Please," she said. That was all. Just the one word, and it contained everything. Caleb stepped back. "Get inside." He reached out and took the small child from her arms before he had thought about it, before the part of his brain that had spent 3 years building walls could stop him. The child was frighteningly light. She weighed almost nothing. Carried her through the door, and heard the woman pull the other two girls in behind her, heard the door shut, heard the wind cut off, like someone had thrown a switch. Shh! He carried the child to the chair he had just been sitting in his chair, the only warm spot in the cold room, warm from his own body, and he set her down in it and put his hands on her face. Her skin was the temperature of creek water in early November. Not frozen, but close enough that the difference barely mattered. How long was she outside? He said. Since the wagon went off the road, the woman said. 3 hours, maybe more. I lost track. I had her inside my coat most of the time, but she stopped shivering about a half-mile back. Stopping shivering. He knew what that meant. He had learned what that meant 3 years ago in the worst possible classroom. What's her name? Wren. He was already moving to the fireplace. He knelt on the stone hearth and reached for the wood box, and it was empty, because he had not brought any in. Because he had not planned on needing it, because he had sat in this chair in the dark making peace with the cold. He stood up and walked to the back door and opened it against the wind, and grabbed the first 3 pieces of split oak from the stack on the porch without his coat on, and the cold went through his shirt like a blade, and he did not care. He built the fire with hands that had not lost their memory for it, whatever else he had let go. Tinder first, then kindling, then the oak laid right, not like a man showing off, but like a man who has built 10,000 fires and knows exactly where each piece needs to go. He struck the match. The flame caught. Behind him he heard the little girl cough. He turned around. The taller of the 2 sisters, the 7-year-old, had pressed herself against the side of watching Wren with an expression that did not belong on a child's face. Too old, too steady, the face of someone who had learned that falling apart was a luxury she could not afford. Coughed, the girl said, like she was reporting it, like she needed someone to confirm it meant what she thought it meant. That's good, Caleb said. Coughing means she's trying. The girl looked at him for a long moment, measuring something. Then she gave a single nod, sharp and deliberate, and turned back to Wren. The woman Mara, she told him later. Mara Voss was already unwrapping Wren's outer layer with hands that shook badly but moved fast. She had done this before. Not this specifically, but the work of caring for someone in crisis he could tell by the efficiency of her movements, the way she didn't waste a second on hesitation. The oldest girl, the one who was maybe 10, stood near the door with her arms wrapped tight around herself. She had stopped shaking, or she was trying very hard to look like she had stopped shaking, which was a different thing. She had the expression of someone waiting for the worst news of her life, with the intention of receiving it with dignity. Caleb looked at her. Can you take your boots off? She blinked. What? Your feet. Get the boots off. Get close to the fire. You've got frostbite risk if you don't warm up the right way. I need to help with Wren. You can help Wren better if your feet work, he said. Not unkindly, just plainly. Sit down. Boots off. She sat. She pulled her boots off with the mechanical obedience of someone who has learned that certain instructions are worth following immediately. Caleb crouched down and looked at her feet through her stockings. White in 2 of the toes. He had seen that before, too. What's your name? Elsie. Okay, Elsie. You feel that burning? Starting to. That's what you want. That means the blood's coming back. He looked up at her. She was trying so hard to hold herself together, and she was doing a remarkable job, and it was the most heartbreaking thing he had seen in a very long time. You did good tonight, he said. Whatever you had to do to get here, you did good. Something in Elsie's face shifted. Not broke, exactly. Just moved. Like a door that had been locked, swinging open an inch. He left her and went to check on Wren. Mara had the child wrapped in the blanket that had been over Caleb's legs, the one she'd grabbed without asking permission, which was the right call. Wren's color was slightly better, which could mean things were improving, or could mean the firelight was just kind. Her breathing was shallow but present. Her lips were no longer quite the same blue they had been. She needs more warmth from the inside, Caleb said. I've got broth on the... He stopped. He didn't have broth on anything. He hadn't cooked a proper meal since sometime in October. I've got dried goods. I can heat water. Get something warm into her. She's not awake enough to drink. Then we wait until she is. He looked at Wren. She's going to wake up. He said it the way you say something when you're not entirely sure it's true, but you've decided to make it true by the force of declaring it. He had not talked that way in a long time. His voice sounded strange to him in his own house. Mara looked at him. She had been in the house for maybe 12 minutes, and she had not once stopped moving, not once put her own comfort ahead of the children's, not once asked him for anything beyond what the situation absolutely required. Now she paused and really looked at him for the first time. "Thank you for opening the door," she said. He almost told her he had hesitated. He almost told her about the 20 seconds he'd spent with his hand on the bolt, telling himself it was wind. He didn't. He just turned away and went to find the pot. The middle girl, Nora, he learned later, appeared at his elbow while he was working at the cook stove, filling the pot from the water barrel. He hadn't heard her move. She was just suddenly there, quiet as a cat, watching him with large, serious eyes. "Can I help?" she said. He looked at her. She was the one who had been watching Wren with that too-old face. Up close, she looked younger again, gap-toothed, with a smear of dried tears on one cheek she hadn't noticed or hadn't bothered with. "You know how to stoke a stove?" She shook her head. "I'll show you." He showed her. She paid close attention, watching his hands, asking one question when she didn't understand something. One question, specific, and then she nodded and tried it herself, and got it right on the first attempt. He said nothing about that, but he noticed it. The water heated. He made something not a proper broth, but warm water with salt and the last of a jar of dried beef he found at the back of a shelf. It wasn't much. It was what he had. While the water heated, he went back to where Wren was. The fire was going strong now, filling the room with orange light and the smell of burning oak, and Wren's face in that light looked softer. The color, better, less like something carved and more like something alive. Mara sat beside her on the floor, with her back against the chair, one hand resting on the child's knee, not gripping, just resting, the specific gesture of someone who has been holding on tight for hours, and is only now, in the first moment of relative safety, allowing themselves to loosen even slightly. Caleb crouched on the other side of the chair. Wren's eyes opened. Not all the way, halfway, heavy and confused, the eyes of someone surfacing from very deep water. She looked at the fire first, then at Mara, then slowly, the way a person's gaze moves when they're not yet sure where they are, at Caleb. He had not had a child look at him in 3 years. Not directly, not like this, with that particular quality of attention that children have, the kind that sees without filtering. He had avoided it, deliberately. He had crossed streets, chosen different pews, turned away at county fairs. He had become remarkably good at being invisible to children. Wren looked at him with her half-open eyes and the firelight on her face and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, small and rough from the cold, "Are you Santa?" The room was absolutely quiet. Caleb heard Elsie make a sound from across the room. Something caught in her throat. Not a laugh, not a sob, something between. He heard Mara's breath change. He felt Nora go very still beside him. He looked at this child, this tiny pale child who had almost died in the snow, who was now looking at him from his own chair, with his own blanket pulled to her chin, her eyes barely open but open, awake, alive, asking him the most impossible question anyone had ever asked him. Something broke in him, not loudly, not all at once. Like ice on a river in the first days of spring. A crack, a shift, a sound you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. He swallowed. He cleared his throat. "No," he said. His voice came out lower than he intended. "I'm just a rancher." Wren considered this with the gravity of someone who is not yet sure the answer is satisfactory. Then she looked around the room at the fire, at Mara, her sisters, at the ceiling, and when her gaze came back to Caleb, it had changed. There was something in it, even half asleep, even cold and exhausted, some small stubborn flame of reassessment. She had walked up to the edge and looked over, and now she was looking at the man who had pulled her back, trying to figure out what he was. "Okay," she said finally, and closed her eyes again, and breathed. Caleb stayed crouched beside the chair for a long moment after she went back to sleep. He did not trust himself to stand up immediately. His knees were fine. It wasn't that. Something else. Something that would have embarrassed him deeply if anyone had been watching, though in fact Mara was watching, and Elsie and Nora, and none of them said a word. He stood up. He went to the kitchen. He stood with his back to the room for a moment, his hands flat on the counter, looking at the wall. Then he turned around and said, to nobody in particular, and all of them at once, "Nobody dies in my house tonight." It came out harder than he intended. Like a command or a decision, or maybe both. Elsie sat up a little straighter. Nora looked at him with those serious eyes. Mara said nothing, just watched him. And whatever she was reading in his face, she seemed to accept it. He started heating the broth. Outside, the blizzard moved through the mountains with everything it had, indifferent and enormous, the way weather is out there, not cruel, just absolute. It had already taken his wagon track. It was working on the road. By morning, no one would be going anywhere, but the fire was going, and Wren was breathing. And Caleb Rourke, who had sat in the cold dark for 3 years, waiting for something he could not name, stood at his cook stove and stirred a pot, and did not, for the first time in a very long time, feel the specific weight of a house that had forgotten what it was for. He did not feel better. That would be too simple, and nothing about that night was simple. He felt cracked open in a way that was closer to pain than relief, a raw and unfamiliar sensation, like a hand that has been numb for hours and is only now remembering what it's like to feel temperature. It hurt. Of course it hurt, but the fire was going. He kept stirring. The broth was thin and not particularly good, but Wren drank it. She woke fully sometime around midnight, cranky and disoriented, and demanding to know where the wagon was, and when Mara told her quietly that the wagon was gone, that they were somewhere safe. Wren looked around the firelit room with the specific suspicion of a 4-year-old who has been told things were fine before and found out otherwise. She studied the ceiling. She studied Caleb, who was sitting in the corner chair he had dragged back from the fire to give them room, trying to be useful without being in the way. She studied the broth Mara held out to her. "Is it good?" Wren asked. "It's warm," Mara said, which was the most honest answer available. Wren drank it anyway, in small, suspicious sips, and did not complain after the first one. Caleb watched this and said nothing. He had not expected to feel anything watching a child drink saltwater broth in bad firelight. He felt quite a lot and did not know what to do with any of it. Elsie fell asleep sitting up, her back against the wall near the hearth, her chin dropping to her chest the way children's do when their bodies finally override their intentions. She had been fighting it for an hour. Caleb had watched her fight. It watched her blink too hard, straighten her spine, press her lips together each time her head started to drop. The girl was exhausting herself trying to stand guard over the others, and there was nothing to stand guard against. Not in here, not tonight. But he didn't say that. It wasn't his place, and she wouldn't have believed him anyway. When she finally went under, her face changed completely. All the tightness left it. She looked her age, which was 10, which was too young for the kind of weight she'd been carrying since she walked through his door. Nora did not fall asleep. Nora sat near the stove, with her knees pulled to her chest, and watched everything with those cataloging eyes. And when Caleb caught her watching him, she didn't look away. She just kept watching, the way an animal does when it's deciding whether something is a threat. "You live here alone?" she asked. "Yes. How long?" He considered lying. It would have been easy. 3 years, he said. Nora thought about this with the seriousness she seemed to bring to everything. "That's a long time." "It is. Were you lonely?" Mara made a small sound from across the room, the sound of a person who wants to tell a child to mind her business and is restraining herself. Caleb looked at Nora, and Nora looked back at him, waiting, not embarrassed by the questions because she didn't yet understand why it might be uncomfortable. "I got used to it," Caleb said. Nora seemed to weigh this answer. "That's not the same as no." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said, "it's not." She nodded like she'd confirmed something, then turned back to watching the fire, apparently satisfied. Caleb sat with the answer he'd just given out loud for the first time, and felt it settle into the room like something that had always belonged there. The blizzard did not let up through the night. He could hear it working on the house, the particular sounds a mountain storm makes when it means business, the groan of timber, the high, thin whistle through gaps in the window frames. He hadn't gotten around to sealing before winter set in. He had not planned on caring about those gaps. Now he got up quietly, found rags in the kitchen, and stuffed them into the worst of the cracks, while the others slept, or didn't sleep, and the wind pushed back against his hands, like something offended. Mara watched him do it. She had put Wren down on a folded blanket near the fire, and was sitting with her back against the wall, close enough to reach the child if she stirred, far enough that she wasn't hovering. She watched Caleb move around the room with the slightly guarded attention of someone who has not yet decided whether they trust the place they've landed. "You don't have to do all that tonight." she said quietly. Not a criticism, just an observation. The gap near the east window's been bad all season, he said. Cold comes in fast. Were you planning to fix it before tonight? He kept his back to her, pressing the rag into the frame. No, she didn't ask him to explain that. He was grateful. Explaining it would have required saying things out loud that he was not ready to say out loud, not to a woman he'd known for 2 hours, not to anyone. He worked his way around the room. Mara watched and said nothing more, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the specific silence of two people who are both too tired and too cautious to be anything other than honest, and who have mutually decided that honesty tonight means keeping their mouths shut. Morning came gray and muffled, the light coming through the frosted windows soft and directionless, the kind of light that makes it impossible to tell what time it is. Caleb was already up. He had not slept particularly well in the chair he'd given the bedroom to Mara and the children without quite deciding to. It had simply happened. Mara had half asked, and he had half nodded, and then suddenly they were in there, and he was in the chair, and that was the arrangement. His neck ached. His lower back was doing something pointed and specific. He ignored both of these things and put the coffee on. He was standing at the stove when he heard footsteps in the hallway, too light for Mara, too deliberate for Wren. Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed, her hair combed badly with her fingers, her eyes alert in a way that suggested she had slept but not long. "Can I help?" she said. Same question as the night before. "You want to learn to start a stove in the morning?" "I already learned that last night." "Then you can do it yourself." Something shifted in her expression, not pride exactly, more like the recognition that the offer was real. She moved to the stove and did exactly what he'd shown her, without rushing it, without showing off, her movements careful and correct. He watched from across the kitchen without commenting. When the burner caught, she looked at him over her shoulder. "Good," he said. She turned back to the stove. He thought he saw the edge of a smile, but he couldn't be sure. Breakfast was a negotiation with what he actually had in the house, which was not much, which was its own kind of embarrassment even if no one said anything about it. He had oats, which were fine. He had a quarter slab of salt pork, most of a tin of lard, some dried beans that would take all day, and 6 eggs he'd forgotten about in the cold of the back room. He scrambled the eggs with the salt pork and made a pot of oats and put both on the table and did not announce them as anything in particular. Wren was the first one to the table, which told him she had recovered enough for her appetite to make its opinions known. She looked at the eggs with her head tilted. "We had eggs on Saturdays," she announced. "Aunt Mara made them with the green stuff." "I don't have green stuff," Caleb said. Wren considered this seriously, as though weighing whether it was a deal-breaker. "Okay," she said finally, and climbed into the chair. Elsie came in next, stiff and formal, and holding herself like someone who had slept badly and was pretending she hadn't. She took the chair across from Wren, looked at the food, looked at Caleb, and said carefully, "Thank you for the meal." It was the sentence of a child who has been taught manners so thoroughly they've become armor. Something in the politeness of it, the practiced correctness, caught in his chest sideways. "Sit down and eat," he said. "It's getting cold." She sat. She ate. He noticed she served Wren before she served herself. Mara came in last, moving like someone whose body hurt in several places and was managing it with dignity. She stopped at the threshold of the kitchen and looked at the table and at Caleb standing to one side of it, and for a moment she just looked, and he had the uncomfortable feeling of being seen more clearly than he intended. "I can cook tomorrow," she said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." The way she said it was not unkind, but it was firm. It was the voice of someone who is not accustomed to accepting charity without contributing something back. "I'm saying I will." He nodded. She sat down. The 6 of them, 5 counting Wren, who was approximately the size of one normal person's appetite, ate scrambled eggs and oats in the kitchen, while the blizzard continued to do its work outside. And Caleb sat at the head of a table that had not had anyone sitting at it in 3 years, and ate his oats, and did not know what to do with his hands when he wasn't eating. The snow kept coming through the rest of Christmas Day and into the day after, piling against the doors and windows, drifting against the barn until the lee side was buried to the roofline. Caleb went out twice to check the animals. He had 3 horses and 11 cattle left, down from the herd he'd run when things were different. And both times he came back into the house and found it changed in some small way. A pair of Wren stockings drying near the fire. Nora sitting at the kitchen table with one of his old almanacs open in front of her, reading without being invited to. Elsie in the corner, mending something of Wren's with needle and thread she'd found somewhere, her face bent close to the work, her stitches small and even. The second time he came in from the barn and found Mara on her knees in the corner of the main room, cleaning 3 years of accumulated dust from the baseboard with a rag she'd dampened from the water barrel. He stopped and looked at her for a moment. "You don't have to do that," he said. "The dust is an inch thick," she said without looking up. "I'm aware. Then you know it needs doing." He hung up his coat and his hat and went to the kitchen, and he could hear her scrubbing behind him, and he stood at the window, looking at the snow and felt something he could not immediately name. Not gratitude, exactly, not resentment. Something in between those two things, uncomfortable and warm at the same time, like blood coming back to a cold hand. The days settled into a kind of accidental order. He had not planned it, and neither had Mara, but structure has a way of appearing when there are children involved, because children require feeding and keeping warm and something to do, or they become a problem, and Wren in particular became a problem when she was bored. She was a focused, energetic kind of problem, the kind that followed you around, asking questions until you answered them, then followed you somewhere else, asking more. By the third day, Caleb had explained to Wren why horses don't like loud noises, how ice forms on a water trough and what you do about it, why the barn smells the way it does, and what a cattle dog is for. All of this while trying to do the actual work of the barn with a 4-year-old at his elbow. He was not patient by nature. He was finding something that might eventually become patience, if given enough time. Nora was the one who asked to come to the barn on the 4th morning. She didn't announce it with enthusiasm, just appeared at his elbow when he was pulling on his coat and said, "Can I come?" He looked at her. "You ever been around cattle?" "No. They're not dangerous, but they're stupid and heavy. And if one steps on you, it doesn't care." He was not trying to discourage her. He was just telling her the truth. "You stay where I tell you. You don't run. You don't shout." "Okay," she said. She was quiet in the barn, not nervous, quiet, just attentive. She watched him pitch hay and paid attention to where the animals moved and stayed out of their way without being told twice. After 20 minutes, he handed her the smaller pitch and showed her the angle, and she tried it and nearly fell over and corrected herself and tried again. "You're doing it right," he said. "You're just not strong enough yet." "I will be," she said. It wasn't bravado. It was just a statement. He believed her. Elsie was harder. He understood that immediately it's not in the way something is difficult because it's bad, but in the way something is difficult because it has been holding too much for too long and has shaped itself around the weight. She was 10 years old, and she moved through the house like a 30-year-old woman, always noting what needed to be done, always doing it before anyone asked, always watching the other two with a specific quality of alertness that was not normal childhood watchfulness. It was the look of someone who has learned that if they stop watching, something terrible might happen. She was in the kitchen the morning of the 5th coffee, already up, already washing the breakfast dishes from a meal she'd made for the younger two before he was out of the chair. He had heard the sounds and stayed where he was, because there is a particular kind of person who needs to be useful the way other people need air, and interrupting them is a specific kind of cruelty. But when she started, on the floor, on her hands and knees at 6 in the morning, scrubbing the kitchen floor that did not need scrubbing, her shoulders bunched up around her ears, working at it with a ferocity that had nothing to do with the floor, he set down his coffee cup. "Elsie," she kept scrubbing. "Elsie." He pulled the stool from the corner and sat down on it, which put him roughly at her eye level. "Stop for a minute." She stopped. She sat back on her heels and looked at him, and her expression was perfectly controlled, which was the problem. "You made breakfast for the girls," he said. "They were hungry. You washed the dishes. They needed washing. Now you're doing the floor." He watched her face. At 6 in the morning, she lifted her chin slightly. "You let us stay here. I'm trying to. I want to help. I don't want to be something you have to carry." There it was. He was quiet for a moment, because what she'd just said required space. It required him not to rush past it with something reassuring, because reassurance was not what she needed. She needed someone to hear the actual words she'd said. "How long have you been trying not to be something somebody has to carry?" he asked. She looked at him. Her jaw tightened. She was deciding how honest to be, and he watched her decide, and he waited. "A while," she said finally. Since your parents died? The jaw did another thing. A flex. A while, she said again. He nodded slowly. When I was about your age, my father's barn burned down. We lost almost everything. And I spent the whole next year trying to be so useful he wouldn't notice how much was gone. He paused. Didn't help him any, but I needed to do something with my hands or I'd have fallen apart. Elsie was very still. So I understand the impulse, he said. But here's the thing, Elsie. You're allowed to fall apart a little. That's not weakness. That's just what happens to people when they've been through what you've been through. He looked at the scrub brush in her hand. The floor can wait until after breakfast. She looked at the floor, then at him. Something was working in her face, the deep, complicated work of a child trying to decide if it's safe to put something down. You don't have to earn your place here, he said. You're here because it's cold outside and you needed a door. That's all the reason required. Elsie swallowed. She put the scrub brush down on the floor and sat there for a moment, and her breathing changed, not into crying, not quite, but into something that lived in the same neighborhood. Then she picked up the brush, set it aside properly against the cabinet, stood up, and walked to the table and sat down and folded her hands. Can I have coffee? She asked. He looked at her. You drink coffee? I'm trying to start. It tastes terrible. I know. He poured her a cup. He put a considerable amount of the dried milk they had in it, which helped, and she wrapped both hands around it and drank it, like someone doing something deliberate, and he sat across from her and had his own. And they did not say anything else, and it was fine. It was more than fine, actually. The blizzard finally broke on the 6th day, leaving behind a silence so complete, it felt like a different kind of weather. The mountains came back, the tree line came back, the sky went the particular hard blue of winter at altitude, the kind of blue that is beautiful in the exact proportion to how dangerous it is. Caleb spent most of that day digging out the barn door, the pathway to the well, the access to the woods stack that had been buried to his shoulder. It was heavy, brutal work, the kind that empties the head, which was why he had always liked it. He was on the 3rd hour of it when he heard crunching behind him and turned to find Nora, wrapped in a coat 2 sizes too large, that he recognized as belonging to him, wielding a shovel she'd found in the barn. He stared at her. I asked Aunt Mara, she said, which was apparently all the explanation she felt was necessary. He handed her the lighter of the 2 shovels, and they worked side by side without talking much. She was not strong enough to move the big drifts, but she was methodical, and she didn't stop, and after a while he realized she'd cleared a stretch of the path he hadn't gotten to yet. You work hard, he said. Our father said, work is the only thing that's really honest, she said, without stopping her rhythm. He thought about that. He sounds like he was a smart man. He was, a pause, a shovelful. He died of fever 2 winters ago. Mama died when Wren was born. Her voice was flat and informational, the way a child's voice goes when they have told a painful thing so many times they've worn the raw edge off it. Then our father's sister took us. She tried. Another shovelful. Is that where Mara's taking you? The elderly relative? Nora nodded without slowing. Caleb stopped digging. He stood with his shovel for a moment, looking at the mountains. What's the relative like? Nora considered this with her characteristic seriousness. Old, she said. Mara says she's kind. We've never met her. He started digging again. He did not say anything more about it, but the information sat in his chest like a stone, and he carried it for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, after the girls were asleep, Wren going down first, dramatic about it, requiring 2 stories from Mara and a glass of water, and the specific blanket, and not that blanket. The other one, he and Mara sat at the kitchen table with the coffee that was actually the last of the coffee, though neither of them mentioned that. Mara wrapped her hands around her cup and looked at it for a while before she said anything. She did that. He'd noticed she let things sit before she put words on them. It was a habit that required confidence, the confidence that the other person would wait. He did not know if she knew she was doing it. Nora told me she came out and helped you dig today, she said. She did. She didn't ask me first. She told me she did. Mara made a small sound. She told you, she asked. She asked on the way out the door while putting on her coat. She shook her head, but there was something in her expression that was not entirely disapproval. She's been like that since she was 4. When she decides something is the right thing to do, the asking is a formality. She's good with the animals too, he said. Natural feel for them. She doesn't force it. Mara looked at him. You've been watching them. Hard not to, he said. In a small house. She was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, I want you to know that we'll be gone as soon as the road clears enough. I don't want to overstay what you offered." He looked at his coffee. He thought about the road. The road over the mountain pass, which was almost certainly buried to impassability and would stay that way for weeks, maybe until February. He thought about Nora shoveling in a coat 3 sizes too large. He thought about Elsie's hands around a coffee cup she didn't like. He thought about Wren, asleep right now in the room down the hall, with his blanket pulled to her chin. "The road won't clear for a while," he said. "I know. Weeks at minimum. I know that too." She said it without complaint or self-pity, just acknowledgement. She had the quality of someone who has been in difficult situations before, has learned that acknowledging them plainly is less exhausting than pretending. He looked up from his coffee. "Where were you headed?" "The relative, where is she?" 2 days east on the other side of the pass, in good weather." She paused. "Her name is Ruth. She's my husband's great aunt. She said she'd take the girls if I brought them before spring, before her own situation changes." "What's your situation? After you bring them?" She looked at him steadily. "I find work. Somewhere." She said it the way people say things they've rehearsed to themselves until they believe them. Or almost believe them. "You have money?" She hesitated 1 second too long. "It's not a criticism," he said. "I'm asking because the pass won't open, and you've got 4 mouths to feed, and whatever you came with is whatever you came with." She put her cup down on the table. "Precisely. I have enough to get the girls settled with Ruth and buy passage east on the stage. And then I figure it out." She said it quietly but without a crack in it. She meant it. She had already decided it, and she was living toward it, and he could see that any expression of doubt about it would not be welcome. He said, "Okay." She looked at him, slightly surprised by the lack of argument. "Okay," he said again. "Then that's the plan." They drank their coffee. The fire popped once in the other room. Outside, the mountain country was still and frozen and merciless, in the way it always was, the way it had been when his wife and daughter went out into it 3 years ago, and did not come back, the way it had been before that, and would be long after Caleb Rourke and his kitchen table and his last cup of coffee were gone. He had gone out after them. That was the part he never told anyone, the part that lived in him like a splinter that had gone too deep to remove cleanly. He had gone out after them and found them, and it had been too late by an hour, maybe less, maybe less. He had never been able to stop doing that arithmetic, has never been able to stop measuring the distance between 1 hour and never. He was not thinking about this at the table, or he was thinking about it the way he always thought about it always, at some low frequency beneath everything else, the way tinnitus under all other sound. He was also thinking about a 4-year-old who had looked at him across a dark room and asked if he was Santa, and who was now sleeping in the room his daughter had slept in. He was thinking about that, and about the road, and about February, and about the carved wooden star that was in the box at the back of the bedroom closet, the box he hadn't opened in 3 years, and he was not yet thinking about what he intended to do about any of it. He just sat at the table and drank his coffee while it was still warm enough to drink. "My husband's name was Peter," Mara said, out of nowhere, the way people say things when the quiet has gotten long enough that words feel like they cost less. Caleb looked at her. "He died 18 months ago. Fever, same as the girl's father." She kept her hands around her cup. "He was a good man, not a perfect one, but good." A pause. "I'm not going to pretend I haven't figured out what I am now, without him. I just know that those girls needed somebody, and I was the only somebody available. You could have sent them ahead on their own." She looked at him like that was the most absurd thing she'd ever heard. "No," she said, "I couldn't have." He nodded. They sat in the kitchen for another little while, not talking, and then Mara said she was going to check on Wren, and went down the hallway, and Caleb sat alone at the table with his empty cup and the dying fire and the sound of the wind that had come back up. Quieter now, but still there, still reminding him of everything it was capable of. He got up. He went to the window. He looked out at the dark and the snow and the mountains he could not see, but knew were there, enormous and uncaring and permanent. Then he went to the woodpile and brought in enough wood for the night and the morning, and most of the day after that. He built the fire up high, higher than he needed, high enough that the house would stay warm until morning without any more attention, warm enough that nobody in it would wake up cold. He had not done that in 3 years. He went to bed in the chair and lay with his eyes open for a while, listening to the house breathe around him. The small sounds of people sleeping, breathing, existing in the rooms he had let go empty, and he did not feel better, exactly, but he felt something. He felt the particular weight of a house that had not forgotten what it was for. He found the box on a Wednesday. He hadn't gone looking for it. That was the thing he would come back to later. In the small hours when sleep wouldn't cooperate, he hadn't gone in there with any intention. He had gone into the back bedroom to find an extra wool blanket because Wren had decided, with the absolute authority of a 4-year-old, that the blanket she currently had was insufficient, and Mara had asked him quietly if he had another one. And he had said yes without thinking, because he did have another one, in the closet in the back bedroom. The back bedroom was where his daughter had slept. He hadn't been in it since the spring after she died, when he'd gone in once to close the window that had blown open in a March storm and had stood in the middle of the room for 20 minutes unable to move, and then had walked out and shut the door and had not opened it since. He had given Mara and the girls the main bedroom without thinking about this. The main bedroom had been his and Anna's, but it was just a room, just furniture, just a bed. The back bedroom was different. He opened the closet. He found the blanket on the top shelf, right where it had always been, because nothing in that room had moved in 3 years. He pulled it down and a box came with it, not a large box, just a wooden one the size of a hat box, coming off the shelf edge where it had been balanced against the folded blanket, falling before he could catch it, hitting the floor and the lid coming loose and the contents sliding partway out onto the hardwood. He stood looking at what had come out of the box for a long moment. A child's hair ribbon, red gone faded at the fold lines. A small leather shoe, just one he did not know where the other one had gone, and the not knowing of that had bothered him for 3 years in a specific and wordless way. 3 drawings on brown paper in the large, uncertain lines of a child who is learning what her hands can do, each one labeled in his wife's handwriting. Lucy, age 4. Lucy, age 4. Lucy, age 4. And there, halfway out of the box, caught on the ribbon, as though it had been placed there deliberately, by someone who understood irony, a small carved wooden star. He had made it himself, the winter before the storm, sitting at the kitchen table over 3 evenings with a knife and a piece of pale ash wood from the woodpile, the kind of patient whittling a man does when he has nowhere to be, and someone he loves watching from across the table. Lucy had watched him make it. She had asked about every cut, every angle. Why that side and not this side? Why smooth it there? He had answered every question. He had given her the finished star, and she had held it with both hands and looked at it with an expression he had never been able to find the right word for, not joy exactly, though it was that too. Something more serious. The expression of someone receiving something that matters. Anna had put it on the small pine they cut every Christmas. Lucy had been the one to place it at the top. He picked everything up from the floor carefully, the way you pick up something broken when you don't know yet all the pieces that have come apart. He put it back in the box. He put the lid on. He stood in the small, cold bedroom with the box under his arm and the blanket over his shoulder, and he breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth 4 times, which was something a doctor in town had told him about once, years ago, and which he had never entirely believed in, but which gave his body something to do while his mind sorted itself out. Then he walked out of the room, pulling the door behind him, and went down the hall and gave Mara the blanket. She looked at his face. She didn't say anything about what she saw there, which he was grateful for. She just took the blanket and said thank you and went to put it on Wren. He put the box on the kitchen table. He didn't open it again. He just left it there and went outside to check on the horses, which didn't need checking, and stood in the barn with his forehead against the neck of the oldest mare for a while. And the mare tolerated this without complaint. He had not told anyone about Lucy, not Mara, not the girls. He had not said her name since the funeral, not out loud, not to another person. He said it sometimes alone on the property, when the particular quality of winter light came in at a certain angle, when the wind did something in the pines that sounded like something specific. He said it then, quietly, once, the way you touch a bruise to check if it still hurts. It always did. He had stopped being surprised by that. He did not know what to do with the box. Nora found it. Of course, Nora found it. Nora moved through the house with a quiet, systematic attention to everything in it, cataloging, noting, understanding. He came in from the barn to find her sitting at the kitchen table, with her hands in her lap, not touching the box, not opening it, just looking at it. "What's in it?" she asked. "Things that belong to someone," he said. He hung up his coat. He poured water into the basin and washed his hands. "Who?" He dried his hands on the kitchen towel. He stood with his back to her for a moment. "My daughter." The kitchen was very quiet. "You had a daughter?" Nora said, and there was nothing in her voice except the question, no discomfort, no performance of sympathy, just the plain fact of not knowing and wanting to know. "Yes." "How old was she?" "4 when she died." Nora was silent for a moment. He turned around and she was looking at the box with an expression that he recognized. It was the same expression she'd worn in the barn, the one she used when she was putting information into its proper place in the architecture of her understanding. "Same age as Ren," she said. "Yes." She looked up at him. "Is that why it's hard? When Ren talks to you?" He sat down across from her. He didn't plan to. His legs just made the decision. He sat down and put his hands on the table and looked at this 7-year-old who had just asked him the most precise question anyone had put to him in 3 years. "Part of it," he said. Nora nodded. She seemed to understand that this was all he was going to say, and she accepted it without pressing. And they sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes in the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. "Can I see what's in it?" she asked. "Only if you want me to." He reached over and put his hand on the lid. He did not open it. "Not right now," he said. "Okay, that was all." She slid off her chair and went back to whatever she'd been doing before. And he sat alone at the table with the box under his hand and the afternoon light coming through the window and the house full of sounds it hadn't made in years, small sounds, domestic sounds, the sound of someone in the other room, the sound of not being alone. He put the box on the shelf by the kitchen door. He didn't put it away. He left it where he could see it, which was different from what he would have done a week ago, and he did not examine why too closely. Ren found it 4 days later. He should have anticipated this. Ren's relationship with the concept of personal property was still developing, and her curiosity operated without a filter, between impulse and action. He heard the lid come off from across the house, heard the small sound of objects being investigated, and knew before he got to the kitchen doorway what he was going to find. Ren sat on the kitchen floor with the box between her knees, the red ribbon around her neck like a necklace, one of the drawings open in her lap. She was looking at the wooden star, holding it up to the window light, turning it slowly, the way children examine things they find beautiful. "Ren." He said her name and it came out tight, not angry but compressed, the voice of a man trying to manage multiple things at once with limited capacity. She looked up. She had the expression of someone who has been caught doing something and is rapidly calculating whether it was actually wrong. "It's pretty," she said about the star. She held it out toward him. "What is it?" He crossed the room and crouched down. He took the star from her, carefully, not snatching it. He looked at it in his palm for a moment. The wood had gone warm from her hands. "It's a star for a Christmas tree," he said. Ren looked at it, then at him. "We don't have a Christmas tree." "No, we should have a Christmas tree." She said this with the conviction of someone announcing a self-evident truth. Elsie said, "We already missed Christmas, but I don't think Christmas goes away just because you missed it." Something in him that had been clenched for days, for years, shifted slightly, like a knot that has been pulled from both ends. For so long it's begun to loosen whether you intend it to or not. "Who does the star belong to?" Ren asked. He looked at her. Her eyes were brown and direct and entirely without agenda, the eyes of someone who only wants the accurate answers and has no particular fear of what it might be. "It belonged to my daughter," he said. "Her name was Lucy." Ren received this. "Where is she?" "She died 3 years ago. In a storm." Ren's face did the thing children's faces do when they encounter a sorrow that is too large to process all at once. A brief stillness, a reconfiguration, a settling. "That's sad," she said, not as a performance, just as a fact. "Is that why you were sad at Christmas?" He looked at her. She had noticed then. Of course she had noticed. Children notice everything. They just don't always have the vocabulary to ask about it until they do. "Yes," he said again. Ren looked at the star in his hand. She reached out and touched the edge of it with one finger, lightly the way she had touched the nose of the barn cat, on the first day he'd let her near it. "Can we still put it on a tree?" she said. "For Lucy?" Kitchen was completely silent. He heard Mura in the doorway before he saw her heard the small intake of breath that told him she had been there, long enough to hear at least part of it, that she was watching and had chosen not to interrupt. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on Ren and the star and the red ribbon around Ren's neck that had been his daughter's. Let me think about that, he said. It was not a no. He heard himself say it and recognized that it was not a no, that the no he would have said automatically a week ago had been replaced by something more uncertain and more honest. Wren heard the difference too. She looked at him with those clear eyes and seemed to understand that she had gotten as much as was available right now. And she nodded and handed him the ribbon from around her neck and let him put the things back in the box. He carried the box to his chair in the main room and sat with it in his lap for a long time. Mara did not come in. She gave him the room. He understood it as the deliberate act it was. She had seen enough to know he needed it, and she was a woman who understood, apparently, when to stay back and when to come forward, which was not a small thing. He sat with the box and the star inside it and the drawings and the one small shoe and the faded ribbon, and he thought about Lucy. He let himself think about her, the way he usually didn't, not the last day, but the other days, the ordinary days, the mornings she came into the kitchen already talking. Before she'd finished waking up, the way she said his name when she wanted something, the exact weight of her on his shoulders, when he carried her that way, the drawings she did at the table while he worked, questions she asked that he hadn't always had good answers to and had tried anyway. He thought about the star in her hands this night he finished it, the way she'd held it. He thought about Wren holding it up to the window light, 4 days after Christmas, turning it slowly, saying it was pretty. He was not ready to put it on a tree. He was not ready for Christmas in this house, not for decorations, not for ceremony, not for any of the things that Christmas required of a person who still had full use of their grief. He knew this about himself. He was also not the only person in this house anymore. That was the thing he kept arriving at, from whatever direction he approached it. He was not alone in here. There were 3 girls and a woman, and the 3 girls had already lost more than children should lose. And they were stuck on this mountain for another month at minimum. And Wren had asked a question with no guile in it whatsoever, it on behalf of Lucy as much as herself, and he did not know what to do with that. What he did eventually was get up. He put on his coat and went outside. He walked past the barn, past the frozen water trough, past the fence line, into the tree stand on the north side of the property. He stood among the pines for a while, with the cold working through his coat, and his breath coming out in a short visible clouds, and he looked at the trees. They were young pines, most of them 15 years of growth, not tall, the tallest maybe 8 feet, the shortest 4. He picked one. It was not a dramatic moment. He stood in front of a tree that was a little under 5 feet, reasonably shaped, and he looked at it for a while, and then he went back to the barn and got the small axe. He had the tree down in 6 cuts. He dragged it back toward the house by the trunk, the branches whispering through the snow, and he was halfway across the yard when the back door opened, and Nora stood in the frame. She looked at the tree. She looked at him. She said nothing. "You going to stand there or help me carry it?" he said. Came down the steps and grabbed the trunk on the other side, and together they carried it to the door. Wren heard them before they got it through. She appeared in the hallway with her hair still messed from sleeping and her eyes enormous and said, "Is that a Christmas tree?" with an intensity that suggested she had been waiting her entire life for this question. "It's a pine tree I cut down," Caleb said. "If we put it inside, it becomes a Christmas tree. That's how that works." Wren stared at him. Then she turned and ran back down the hallway, screaming Elsie's name. He looked at Nora over the tree. Nora had the expression she always had, serious, quiet, taking everything in. But something had shifted in it, something small and warm. "Thank you," she said. "Help me get it through the door," he said. They got it through the door. Elsie appeared from the bedroom, with Wren hanging off her arm, still yelling about the Christmas tree, and Elsie's face did something complicated. The careful composure she wore like a second skin cracked open for just a moment, and underneath it was a 10-year-old who had missed Christmas and had been pretending not to care about missing it. She pressed her lips together. She blinked several times. "We need a stand for it," she said very practically. "I'll make one," Caleb said. "I can help," Nora said. "You two can both help," he said. "Get your coats." Mara came out of the kitchen and stood watching him with her arms crossed, and an expression he couldn't quite read. Not quite surprise, not quite approval. Something between 2 things that lived closer to the way people look when something they had stopped expecting actually happens. "Are you sure?" she said, low just to him. "No," she said. He picked up the axe. "But I'm doing it anyway." He and Nora built the stand from scrap wood in the barn, a cross base, with a notch cut in the center to hold the trunk. Simple and functional and not pretty, but it held. Elsie held the tree upright while he fixed it in place, and she was stronger than she looked, bracing it with both arms and not complaining about it. Wren supervised from the barn doorway, offering opinions on the tree's straightness with great authority and limited accuracy. When they brought it inside and stood it in the corner of the main room, it looked too large for the space and slightly crooked and dropped needles on the floor immediately. Wren declared it the most beautiful Christmas tree she has ever seen. Elsie said it was listing to the left. Nora said she could fix that and went for a piece of shim. Caleb stood back and watched them work around it and felt something he had no clean word for. Not happiness, exactly. More like the specific sensation of a room filling up with something it had been missing, which is not the same as happy, but is related to it in the way that breathing is related to running, the same basic mechanism, different intensity. He went to the kitchen shelf. He took down the box. He carried it to the main room and set it on the table and opened the lid. He took out the ribbon, the drawings, the one small shoe, and he set them aside. He picked up the star. He stood with it in his hand in the middle of the room, while Wren and Nora and Elsie argued about the lean of the tree, and Mara came in and stood beside him, close but not touching, looking at the star. "You don't have to," she said. "Wren asked me," he said. "Wren asks you for a lot of things." "Yes." He looked at the star. "This one I can actually do something about." He turned to the three girls. "Come here a minute." They came, even Wren, who stopped mid-sentence about the tree and cross-teased the room with the seriousness of someone who recognizes a significant moment. He crouched down so he was at their level. Wren and Nora close, Elsie a step behind but present. He held the star out on his palm. "This belonged to my daughter," he said. "Her name was Lucy. She died 3 winters ago, in a storm. She was 4 years old." He paused. "This was hers. She put it on the Christmas tree the last Christmas we had together." He looked at the star. "I wasn't going to put it out anymore. I thought it was better to keep it put away." Wren was looking at him with the full force of her attention, which was considerable. "But Wren asked me something the other day," he said, "and I've been thinking about it, and I think she was right." He looked at Wren. "You were right. Some things shouldn't be locked in a box." Wren's eyes moved to the star, then back to him. "Can I put it up?" she asked. "For Lucy?" "I was going to ask you to," he said. He stood up. He held the star out. Wren took it in both hands with that seriousness. The seriousness was not usually hers, but that seemed to arrive for moments that deserved it. She looked at the tree, and then at the star, and then at Caleb. "I'll need to be tall," she said. "I know," he said. He picked her up. He held her against his chest, and she was 4 years old and light, and she smelled like the soap Mara made from the lard and the dried herbs she'd found in his kitchen cabinet, and she reached up with both hands and put the carved wooden star at the top of the tree. It sat there slightly off-center, imperfect, listing like the tree itself listed, caught the firelight and threw it back in warm pieces across the ceiling. Wren looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Caleb, her face very close to his, and said, "Is that okay?" He could not speak for a moment. He worked on it and got there. "Yeah," he said, "that's okay." She seemed satisfied. She wiggled to be put down, and he set her down, and she went immediately back to bossing Nora about the tree's lean. He stood where he was for a moment, looking at the star on the tree, the firelight on the ceiling. Mara appeared beside him. She had the box in her hands. She had taken the ribbon and the drawings and the shoe out. He hadn't realized she'd done it, and she held them out to him separately. Not in the box, just in her hands. "You might want these somewhere else," she said, "not locked away." He looked at the things in her hands. The shoe, the drawings, the ribbon. "I have a shelf," he said, "in the main room." "That seems right," she said. He took them from her. He went to the shelf above the fireplace, the one where he kept nothing, had kept nothing for 3 years. The surface bare, which he had always told himself was simply tidiness. He set the drawings against the wall. He put the shoe beside them. He draped the ribbon across the corner of the frames. Then he stood back and looked at it. Behind him, Wren was telling Nora that the tree needed something on the branches, that a tree with only a star was an unfinished tree, and Nora was asking Mara with her eyes whether this was true, and Mara was going to the bedroom and coming back with something, the spare ribbons from the girl's travel bag, thin red and blue ones, the kind used to tie parcels, Not Christmas decoration, but available and colorful. Elsie tied the first one onto a branch with careful fingers, a small neat bow. She stood back and looked at it. Then she tied another. Nora found 2 brass buttons in the kitchen utility drawer and hung them from branches with thread, which was absurd and also somehow exactly right. Wren wanted a piece of tin foil from around the biscuit wrap to put on the tree, and Mara said yes, and Wren crumpled it into a ball and hung it from the highest branch she could reach, which was about 2 feet up. Tree looked like something made by people who had very little to work with and gave everything they had anyway. It was uneven, and the decorations were domestic scraps, and it held a carved star at the top that had belonged to a dead child. And it was the realest Christmas tree Caleb had stood in front of in as long as he could remember. He sat down in his chair. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded, and he looked at the tree with the firelight on it, and the star at the top, and the 3 girls still adding things to it, still finding small objects to tie to branches, still improving it by their own private standards. Something broke in him then, not quietly this time, not like ice cracking at a distance, more like a dam that has been under pressure for so long that when it finally goes, it doesn't go with drama, it just opens. He put one hand over his mouth. He sat forward in the chair, not making a sound, just letting it happen. 3 years of it happening at once. And he was not a man who cried easily, or often, or without profound resistance. But what moved through him, in that chair in front of that tree, had been building, since the night he heard the knock at the door, since the moment Wren looked at him, and asked if he was Santa, since Nora asked him if that was why it was hard, since Elsie sat at the kitchen table with a cup of terrible coffee, and tried to earn her place in a house she only needed to exist in. Right there in the chair, quietly, his hand over his mouth, he let himself grieve what he had been refusing to grieve. For 3 years, not the loss of them. He had never stopped grieving the loss of them. But the right to continue living alongside it, which he had taken from himself as a form of punishment, and which, it turned out, he had never actually deserved to lose. Mara saw. She was the only one. The girls were occupied with the tree, and Mara was standing to the side, and she saw. And she did not look away, and she did not come over, and she did not say anything. She just looked at him with brown eyes that had their own grief in them and let him have his. After a while it passed, the way those things do not cleanly, not completely, but enough. He cleared his throat. He looked at the tree. Wren turned around and looked at him. "Do you like it?" she asked. He said. His voice was rough but present. "I like it a lot." She turned back to the tree, satisfied. Nora glanced at him, over her shoulder, just a glance, just the registering of what she had probably noticed and would say nothing about, because Nora understood already. At 7, what to do with another person's private moment. Caleb sat in his chair, and the fire burned, and the tree stood in the corner with its absurd decoration and its perfect star. And outside the mountain winter continued its long indifferent work, and he looked at it all, at the room, and the people in it, and the things on the shelf above the fireplace, and he felt the shape of something forming in him, not yet words. Not yet a decision, but moving toward one. He thought about the road that would not open until February. He thought about 2 days east in good weather, an old woman named Ruth, a plan that Mara had rehearsed until she could say it without trembling. He thought about Nora and the pitchfork, and the one question she had answered about it, "I will be." He thought about Elsie's hands on the coffee cup, about Wren in his arms, reaching up, about this house which he had been letting go of room by room, and piece by piece for 3 years, and which, tonight, had more life in it than it had held since before the storm. He thought about what it would mean to them leave in February. He thought about what it would take to ask them not to. He was not ready to say it out loud. Not tonight. Tonight was for the tree and the star and the space that had opened in him, space where 3 years of locked grief had been, which was enormous and cold and beginning, only beginning, to fill with something else. But the thought was there. He had let it in the same way he had let them in, on a night when the cold was doing its worst, and something knocked at the door, and he had stood with his hand on the bolt telling himself it was wind. It was not wind then. It was not nothing now. He sat in his chair in the firelight and watched his house be a home, and he let himself want it. He said it 3 days after Christmas. Not planned, not rehearsed, it came out the way honest things sometimes do, sideways and unexpected, in the middle of something else, entirely. They were in the kitchen. Mara was making biscuits, which she had been doing every other morning since she'd taken over the cooking as promised, and which were considerably better than anything Caleb had produced in the previous 3 years. He was at the table with the ranch ledger open in front of him, going through numbers he had been avoiding since that October, when the arithmetic had stopped being something he could look at without feeling like the floor was tilting. The numbers were bad. Not catastrophic. He had land, he had the herd, he had the horses, but 3 years of a man managing a working ranch with the energy of someone who does not particularly care whether the ranch survives was visible in the ledger, in a way that was hard to argue with. Nora was outside in the yard doing something purposeful. He could see her through the window, moving between the barn and the fence line with a deliberateness that suggested she had invented a task for herself. Elsie was in the main room teaching Wren some kind of hand game that required counting, and Wren kept losing count, and Elsie kept starting over with a patience that Caleb recognized as hard-won. The biscuit smell filled the kitchen. The fire in the stove was going. Outside, the mountain was doing what it did in January, which was everything in its power to remind you of its size. He looked at the ledger, he looked at the window, he looked at the back of Mara's head. "Stay through the winter," he said. She went still at the counter. Not dramatically, just the small stillness of someone who heard something they weren't expecting and is taking a moment before they respond to it. "Don't take the girls to Ruth's," he said. "Not yet. Stay here. Stay through the winter at least." And he stopped. He had not fully planned this, and the absence of planning was becoming apparent. He started again. "The road won't open until February at the earliest. Maybe March if the weather stays like this. And even when it opens, the pass in February it's not a safe for a wagon with 3 children. You know that." Mara turned around. She had flour on her hands and on the front of her dress, and she looked at him with the careful, direct attention she brought to everything she was actually thinking about. "I know that," she said. "So stay, I've got the room. I've got the food enough. If we're careful, I ran the numbers this morning." He looked at the ledger and back at her. "The girls need somewhere stable. Elsie needs to stop being the adult in the room. Nora needs," he gestured at the window, at Nora moving purposefully across the yard. "She needs work, real work. She needs to learn the land. Wren needs to stop nearly freezing to death." He paused. "And the ranch needs." He stopped again. "What does the ranch need?" Mara said. Her voice was not challenging. It was the voice of someone who wants the actual answer. "Someone who gives a damn about it," he said. It came out flat and honest and slightly rougher than he intended. I let a lot of things go. I didn't care enough to stop it. But I'm finding that I care again. A little, and a ranch you care about a little is a ranch you can lose to winter without much fight. A ranch you care about properly is something else." Mara was quiet. She looked at the counter, at the biscuit dough she'd been working. She pressed her thumb into it once, testing Caleb, she said. "I want to be clear about what I understand you to be offering." "Shelter," he said, "through the winter, for you and the girls. That's what I'm offering. And in return, nothing's in return. It's not a transaction." She looked at him steadily. "I don't accept charity. I know you don't. I'm not offering it." He kept his hands on the table, open, the way a man keeps his hands when he wants to be clearly understood. "I'm offering shelter because it's cold and the road is closed and you need it. If while you're here you happen to cook and clean and help with the work, that's not payment. It's just living in the same house doing what needs doing. There's a difference." She considered him. He could see her weighing it, looking for the angle, the catch, the thing that would make it cost more than it appeared to cost. He understood why she was looking. In her experience, probably, things that looked like simple offers from men to women traveling alone were rarely simple. "Nothing else is being asked," he said, "just to be clear." Something shifted in her expression, not relaxation exactly, more like the adjustment of someone who has been braced for a particular blow, and it hasn't come. "I know that," she said quietly. "I know that about you." He nodded. She turned back to the counter. She worked the dough for a moment in silence. "Through the winter," she said. "We reassess in the spring. And if in the spring I decide it's time to take the girls to Ruth, then you take them to Ruth," he said. "No argument. No conditions." She was quiet for a moment longer. "Then the girls will need to know this is temporary. I won't let them settle into something I might have to pull them out of. They've had enough of that." "That's fair," he said. "Especially Wren. Wren attaches fast." He thought about Wren in his arms, reaching up to place the star. I know, he said. Mara turned around again. She looked at him for a long moment with flour on her hands, and the biscuit smell in the air, and the mountain light coming cold through the window. Okay, she said. Through the winter. He picked up his pencil. He went back to the ledger. She went back to the biscuits. Outside, Nora was heading back to the barn. It was not a dramatic moment. He was aware that it should probably have been bigger, that a man asking a woman and 3 children to stay in his house through the mountain winter was not a small thing. That in another kind of story, this would have been the moment where everything swelled and resolved. But it was just a kitchen in January, and 2 people who were both too practical and too worn to perform feelings they were only beginning to sort out, and the biscuits needed finishing, and the ledger needed looking at. And outside the mountain did not care one way or the other. Telling the girls was Mara's job, and she did it that evening, after supper, in the main room with the tree still standing in the corner and Lucy's star at the top. Caleb stayed at the kitchen with the pretense of cleaning up, but the rooms were small, and he heard everything. Wren's response was immediate and uncomplicated. Good. As though it had always been the obvious decision, and she was merely relieved the adults had caught up. Nora said nothing audible, but he heard her get up and cross the room, and then Mara made a small sound that suggested Nora had put her arms around her, which was not something Nora did casually. Elsie said after a long pause, "Is it okay with him?" Mara said, he offered. Another pause. Then Elsie's voice, careful and measuring, "We should make sure we earn it." And Mara gently but clearly, "Elsie, we've talked about this." Silence. Then the creak of the floorboard that meant Elsie had shifted her weight, which she did when she was accepting something she hadn't fully agreed to. Caleb put the clean pot on its hook and went to sit in his chair and said nothing about any of it. January moved the way January does in the high country, not fast, not dramatic, just relentlessly. Cold was a physical presence in the mornings, the kind that gets into the walls and the floor and requires serious negotiation with the stove before the house becomes livable. Caleb had the negotiation down to a system. Nora learned the system by the end of the first week and started running it herself, without being asked, peering in the kitchen, before anyone else each morning, getting the stoves going, putting the water on. He started taking her to the barn every day. It was not a lesson exactly. He did not frame it as one. He just did the work, and she came along and did what she could and asked questions when she didn't understand something, and didn't ask them when she did. She learned faster than anyone he had ever watched learn ranch work, which was notable, because ranch work is mostly a collection of unglamorous, uncomfortable, physically demanding tasks that reward stubbornness and attention more than any kind of natural gift. Nora had all 3. By the end of the second week, she could feed and water the cattle in the right order and quantity, muck out the barn stalls with a system that kept the work from piling up, and read the horses' moods well enough to know which ones to approach and how. The oldest mare, the one he'd stood against in the barn on the hard nights, had decided Nora was acceptable, which was not a decision she made easily. Caleb watched the mare lower her head to Nora's hand one morning and felt something that might have been pride if he'd been in the habit of identifying it as such. "She likes you," he said. "She likes that I don't rush," Nora said. "Animals can tell when you're in a hurry." "Who told you that?" Nora looked at the mare. "You showed me. You never hurry in the barn." He hadn't realized he was teaching that. He supposed you didn't always know what you were teaching. Elsie was a different project entirely. She did not come to the barn she had tried, once, and one of the cattle had turned faster than expected and knocked her sideways into the fence rail, and she had been unhurt but had turned pale in a way that told him this was not her terrain. He did not push it. There is no point in pushing a person toward the thing they're not built for when there are other things available. What Elsie was built for became clear over the course of January in small ways, and then suddenly in one large way. She was organized, not neatly organized. The way someone keeps a tidy house, she was systemically organized. The way someone manages a problem with a lot of moving parts. He noticed it first in the kitchen, where she had quietly reorganized his provisions over the course of 2 days. Nothing moved dramatically. Nothing he couldn't find, but suddenly he could find everything. And the things they were running low on were at the front, and the things with longest shelf life were at the back. And there was a small paper on the cabinet door in Elsie's handwriting listing what they had and approximate quantities. He stood looking at the paper for a moment. hope that's all right, Elsie said from the doorway. Her voice had the careful neutrality of someone who is fairly sure it's all right, but has learned not to assume. It's more than all right, he said. Do you know what we're going to run out of first? She came to look at the paper. The cornmeal, probably. And the dried beans if Wren keeps eating them like she has been. She paused. We should send someone to town when the road clears enough for a horse, even if the wagon road's still bad. Just for a few provisions. We could manage on what we have, but it would be easier to have more of certain things. He looked at her. She was 10 years old, and she was standing in his kitchen, talking inventory like someone who had been managing a household for years, which he realized, looking at her, she probably had been. Your father's house, he said, after he got sick. You were managing it? She looked at the paper. Somebody had to. He did not say anything to that, because there was nothing to say to it that would be adequate. He just nodded. You're right about the cornmeal. I'll plan a ride to the Hendersons' place. When the temperature comes up, they keep a winter store and they trade. Elsie nodded. She took the paper off the cabinet door, added something to it, and put it back. He told her that evening, quietly, while Nora and Wren were occupied, and Mara was out of earshot. The way you think about a household, the way you see what needs doing before it, becomes a problem that's not common. You know that? Elsie looked at her hands. It's just practical. Most people aren't as practical as they think they are. You actually are. She was quiet for a moment. Then is that useful? On a ranch? It's useful everywhere. He paused. But yes, on a ranch, knowing what you have and what you're going to need, and how much of both, that's the difference between getting through winter and not getting through it. I haven't been as careful about it as I should have been. She looked up at him. I noticed. He almost laughed. He came close enough that she noticed and looked at him with slightly wide eyes, as if she wasn't sure what to do with the possibility of him laughing. I'll try to do better, he said. I'll help, she said. No hesitation, no offer of negotiation, just a statement of fact. I know you will, he said. Wren was not a project. Wren was an event. She had fully recovered from the frostbite risk and the exposure and the hypothermia scare within 10 days, with the resilience of very small children who have not yet learned how serious the things that happen to them are, and was now operating at full capacity, which was considerable. She had decided that the ranch was hers, not in any aggressive sense. She did not assert ownership. She simply moved through it with the comfort and confidence of someone on their own property, investigating everything, forming opinions about everything, announcing those opinions to whoever was nearby. She had opinions about the horses. The bay gelding was her favorite. She had named him Button without asking anyone's permission, and the name had apparently taken because Caleb heard Nora call him Button one morning without any irony. She had opinions about the chickens, which she had been neglecting through the worst of the winter, and which Wren had appointed herself responsible for. Responsibility she took with great seriousness and variable accuracy. She had opinions about the best place to sit in the main room, the correct order in which people should eat, and the proper way to tell a story, which she demonstrated frequently. One evening she climbed into Caleb's chair, his chair, the one he always sat in, with the calm confidence of someone who has decided a throne is available, and she would like to use it. He stood looking at her from across the room. That's my chair, he said. Wren looked around the chair, as though assessing it. It's very comfortable, she said. Yes, that's why it's my chair. She appeared to weigh this. You can sit with me, she said. There's room. There was not room. The chair was one person's chair, sized for an adult man. Wren occupied approximately 1/4 of it. He looked at the chair, and then at Wren, looking at him with complete sincerity, offering to share a chair that was his, in his house, as though this were an act of generosity rather than a takeover. He sat in the other chair. Wren looked satisfied. He looked at Mara, who was doing something with thread in the corner, and who was very carefully not showing any expression whatsoever. You think that's funny, he said. I think it's something, she said, and kept working. The Henderson ride happened on a day in late January, when the temperature came up enough that Caleb felt confident the road was passable by horse, if not by wagon. He went alone, breaking trail through the snow, in the early morning dark, the oldest mare moving underneath him with the steady competence of a horse who has done this before. The Hendersons were a farming family, 10 miles down the mountain. Older couple, Bert and June. He let out a short, ugly laugh, who had been Caleb's nearest neighbors for 15 years, and who had given up sending checks in after the second winter because he had made it sufficiently clear that he would not be checked on. June Henderson opened the door before he finished tying the mare and looked at him the way she always had, like he was a problem she had been hoping would solve itself. "Caleb Rourke," she said. "Alive. Morning, June. It's 6:30 in the morning. The road's good now. It'll soften by afternoon. I came early." She stood aside and let him in. Bert was at the table, older, slower than Caleb remembered. One hand curled in the way that meant the arthritis had gotten worse. He looked up and nodded. "You need provisions?" June said. It wasn't a question. "I've got people at the house," he said. He said it without preamble, without the explanation he'd been building on the ride down. Because once he said the first part, the explanation seemed less necessary than he'd thought. A woman and 3 girls. They were caught in the Christmas blizzard on the pass road. "I've got enough to get through the winter, but I'd like some extras, if you can spare them." June looked at him for a long moment with eyes that had seen a great deal in 70 years and did not miss much. "People," she said. "At your house." "Yes, in the house. That's generally where people stay, June." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She went to the pantry and started pulling things without asking him for a list, which told him she had already formed an opinion about what he needed and was not going to negotiate about it. Came out with cornmeal, dried beans, a jar of preserves, 2 tins of good lard, a wrapped piece of hard cheese that smelled real, and a bundle of dried apple that made his mouth remember what fruit tasted like. "I can pay for most of that," he said. "You'll pay for all of it in the spring when I need the south fence run," she said. "Bert can't do it anymore." He looked at Bert, who shrugged in the accepting way of a man who has made peace with his limitations. "The fence work's not bad," Caleb said. "I'll have help this year." June looked at him, ugly laugh. June looked at him when he said that, just looked with that same thorough attention, and then went back to the pantry for something else she'd remembered. On the ride back, with the provisions in the saddlebags and the mare stepping carefully through the softening snow, he thought about what he had said. "I'll have help this year." He had said it without planning to, and it had come out not like a hope but like a fact, which was interesting. He was not ready to examine what it meant that he was starting to assume a future that included them. But he could feel it happening, the assuming. The way you stop thinking about your house as a temporary arrangement and start thinking about it as a place that will look a certain way in spring, in summer, next winter. He had stopped doing that 3 years ago. He had been doing it again, incrementally, since Christmas Eve. The day he rode back from the Hendersons, he found Mara and Elsie at the kitchen table with the ledger he had left out and a piece of paper between them. He stopped in the doorway with the provisions in his arms. Mara looked up. She had the expression of someone who has done something she is not entirely sure was welcome and is waiting to find out. "You left the ledger on the table," she said. "I know." "I wasn't going through it." She paused. "I was going to put it on the shelf. And then I looked at it." He set the provisions on the counter. "And?" She and Elsie exchanged a look that communicated something he couldn't fully read. Then Mara said, "You're losing money on the east pasture. The grazing return on the 4 head you're running there doesn't cover the fence maintenance cost. If you moved those 4 to the north pasture and let the east go fallow through summer, you'd break even by fall and come out ahead by the following spring." He stood at the counter looking at her. "Elsie saw it first," Mara said. "I just confirmed it." He looked at Elsie, who was sitting very straight and watching him with careful eyes, waiting. "How did you see that?" he said. Elsie looked at the ledger. "East pasture numbers are a different color ink. You changed pens when you were writing them. That means you did them at a different time, when you were thinking differently about them. And the costs were rounded up." She looked at him. "My father rounded up when he didn't want to look at the real number." He stood with his coat still on, the cold still coming off him, and he looked at a 10-year-old who had just read his bookkeeping psychology more accurately than he'd read it himself. "Your father was a smart man," he said. "Seems like that runs in the family." Elsie's careful expression shifted by a fraction, not quite a smile, but the direction of one. He took his coat off. He sat down at the table. "Show me what else you found," he said. They sat at the kitchen table for an hour, the 3 of them, going through the ledger. Mara asked questions that were practical and direct, the questions of someone who had managed money in circumstances and knew which numbers were actually load-bearing. Elsie pointed out 2 more patterns. he hadn't consciously registered. He answered their questions and started seeing the books differently, through eyes that had not been staring at them alone for 3 years, and the numbers stopped feeling like an indictment and started feeling like a problem, because problems could be worked on. You'll need to increase the herd, Mara said at the end of it. Not this year, but by the year after, if you want this to be a going operation. You're undermanned and understocked for the size of the land. I know, he said. That takes capital you don't currently have. I know that too. She looked at the ledger. The timber rights on the north section. You haven't done anything with those. He had forgotten about the timber rights. He had owned them for years and had let them sit, the way he'd let everything sit. There's a mill in Gracie Flats, he said slowly. They've been looking for accessible timber above the snowline. That's worth looking into, Mara said, in the spring. He nodded. He looked at the ledger, at the numbers, the future. They were sketching together around the kitchen table, and he felt the floor solidify slightly under him in a way it had not felt solid in years. They did not talk about what they were doing. They did not name it. It was just 3 people sitting at a table working on a problem that mattered to all of them, for reasons they were not yet ready to examine too closely. February came in hard. There were 3 more snowstorms through the first 2 weeks, none as severe as the Christmas blizzard, but all of them serious. All of them adding to the pack on the ground, all of them pushing the roads opening further toward March. Caleb had stopped thinking about the road with the relief of a man who has been given a reprieve from something he doesn't know how to face. The girls changed the ranch. He saw it and couldn't have stopped it and wouldn't have tried. It wasn't dramatic change. Nothing was fixed perfectly. Nothing was transformed. It was the kind of change that comes from sustained human attention, from people who give a damn applied to something that has been running on no attention at all. The barn was cleaner. The animals were better managed. The house was different in 10 small ways he noticed separately, and then one day registered all at once. Standing in the main room, the curtains straightened, the floor no longer holding 3 years of accumulated inattention. The shelf above the fireplace, with Lucy's drawings and shoe and ribbon, sitting there as plainly and naturally as anything else in the room, not a wound, just a presence. He had started talking about Lucy. Not every day, not at length, not with anything that felt like unburdening more. The way you mention something you've accepted, the way Anna comes up in conversation sometimes, the way his father comes up, the way the dead, who meant something, move into the fabric of daily talk when the living have made enough room for them. He mentioned her once when Wren asked why there was a child's shoe on the shelf. He mentioned her once when Nora asked about the drawings, what they were of. Wren received this information and moved on. Nora asked one question and let the answer be sufficient. Elsie never asked. But one morning he came into the main room and found her standing in front of the shelf looking at the 3 drawings, her hands at her sides. She heard him come in, and she didn't move or turn around. She just said she was a good drawer. For 4. She was, he said. She used to draw horses, but they came out looking like dogs, and she thought that was funny. Elsie turned around then. Her expression was open in a way it rarely was, the careful composure set aside for a moment. Did she have a favorite? Horse? The bay. We had a bay then. He paused. Like Button. Elsie looked at the drawings again. She would have liked him, she said. Yes, he said. She would have. They stood in the main room for a moment in the winter's light, and then Elsie went to do whatever she had been going to do, and Caleb stood in front of the shelf for a little while longer, looking at the drawings and the shoe and the ribbon, and at the life that had grown up around them without replacing them. The night of the second big February storm, with the wind doing its full-throated work against the house, and all 5 of them inside and the fire built high, Mara brought out a deck of cards she'd had in the bottom of her travel bag. He had not played cards in years. He could not have told you why it was not grief. Exactly. It was just one of the things that had fallen away when he stopped having anyone to play with. They played at the kitchen table for 3 hours. Wren cheated, without understanding that she was cheating and lost badly and did not care. Nora played with intense, silent strategy and won 2 out of 5 games. Elsie was better than her face showed, which he appreciated. Mara played with a kind of loose enjoyment that was different from her usual quality of contained practicality. And he understood that this was closer to who she was when she was not under pressure, which was information. He won 1 game and lost the rest, and didn't particularly mind. At the end, when Wren had fallen asleep in her chair, and Nora and Elsie had gone to bed, he and Mara sat at the table with the remains of the card game between them and the fire low and the storm, doing its work outside. They had talked all evening, nothing consequential, just talk. The talk of people who have been in close quarters long enough to run through the formal topics and arrived at the informal ones. He had laughed twice, which he registered, because it was still enough of an event to register. She was looking at the table, at the scattered cards. "Caleb," she said. Yeah, she looked up at him. "Thank you. For all of it." She said it plainly, the way she said most things. "I know I said thank you at the beginning, but that was for the door. This is for," she gestured, slightly, at the room. "At the house. All the rest of it." He looked at the table. "I didn't do it to be thanked. I know you didn't. That's part of why I'm thanking you." He looked up at her. She was looking at him with the brown eyes that had been without hope in the cold on Christmas Eve and which now held something considerably more complex than hope or the absence of it, something steadier, something that had come from 2 months of shared work and shared mornings, and the daily accumulated weight of being in the same house as someone and seeing them without performance. He said, "This house needed what you brought to it." She was quiet for a moment. "We needed what this house had." Outside, the puss pushed against the walls, finding the gaps, the places where the weather got in the way it always did on this mountain. Inside, the fire held. He looked at Mara across the kitchen table, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything about what was in the room with them, what had been growing in the room with them for 2 months, what would need to be named eventually, but did not need to be named tonight. He got up. He put Wren to bed, carrying her down the hall, the way he'd carried her in from the cold on Christmas Eve. Her weight heavier now, she had been eating well, her face relaxed in sleep. He put her down without waking her. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the 3 of them, Wren and Nora and Elsie in the bedroom, that had been empty for 3 years. Then he went to his chair and sat down and listened to the storm in the house, breathing, and did not feel the weight of being alone. Because he was not alone. And that was a fact he was finally, imperfectly, beginning to let himself live inside of. The road opened on the 14th of March. Caleb knew it before anyone told him. He could feel it in the quality of the morning, something different in the air. A loosening the particular sound travels when the snow has finally begun to surrender its hold on the mountain. He went out at first light and stood in the yard and looked south, toward the pass, and he could see the change in the tree line, where the weight had shifted, where the road had begun to show its edges again, through the white. He stood there for a while, before going back inside. Mara was already up. She was at the stove, and she had watching him through the window. And when he came in, she did not ask what he had seen because she already knew, from the way he came through the door, not heavy, not light, just careful. The way a man moves when he is carrying something he hasn't decided what to do with. Poured him coffee. She put it on the table. She sat down across from him and wrapped her hands around her own cup. "How long?" she said. "A week, maybe, before it's passable for a wagon." He looked at the coffee. 2 weeks to be safe. The runoff will be bad through the lower section." She nodded. She looked at her cup. They sat in the kitchen while the house was still sleeping around them, the fire going, the mountain light coming up gray and slow through the window. "I need to write to Ruth," she said finally. "Let her know we're coming." He looked at her. She was looking at the table, at her hands, and her face had the quality it got when she was managing something that contained forward-facing expression of a woman who has made a decision and is now executing it with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything else. "Mara," he said. She looked up. He had thought about this through February. He had thought about it while fixing fence in the cold, and while running the barn work, and while sitting at the kitchen table going through the ledger with Elsie, and while lying awake in his chair, listening to the house breathe around him at night. He had thought about how to say it. What words would be accurate without being more than he could back up, what he was actually asking, and whether he had the right to ask it. He had not found the perfect version of it. He had just found the true one. "I don't want you to go," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. He stopped, started again. "I'm not asking you to stay because I need the help, or because the road's soft, or because the girls have settled. I'm asking because I don't want this house to go back to what it was." He looked at her steadily. "And I don't think that's about the house." Mara held her cup with both hands and looked at him for a long time without speaking. He waited. He had learned, over 3 months, that she needed the space to think before she talked, that rushing her produced nothing useful, and that what came out after the silence was almost always worth waiting for. "Caleb," she said. Her voice was level, but something underneath it was not. "I want to be honest with you. That's all I'm asking for. I have thought about staying." She said it plainly. The way she said things, she'd already weighed carefully and decided to stand behind. "I've thought about it since January. Since the ledger, maybe before that." She paused. "And there is something here between us, in this house, that I haven't felt in a long time and didn't expect to feel again." She looked at him. "But I'm not staying because of that. I can't make a decision for 4 people based on something I haven't fully sorted out yet." "I know," he said. I know. The girls come first. They always come first." She looked at him. "You understand what I'm saying? You're saying you need to decide for the right reasons, not the easy ones." She nodded. Something in her face shifted the relief of being understood without having to fully explain. "Peter was a good man," she said. "And he died and I did not fall apart, which surprised me because I thought I would. I just kept going, kept doing what needed doing." She looked at the window. And somewhere in all that keeping going, I forgot to think about what I actually wanted. I just thought about what was necessary. She looked back at him. "You're the first thing in a long time that has felt like both." He sat with that. He did not rush past it. "So what do you want?" he said. "Not what's necessary. What do you want?" She was quiet for a moment. "I want the girls to have a home, a real one, not a way station." She paused. "I want to stop waking up at night running arithmetic about what I can and cannot afford." Another pause. She stopped. She looked at her hands. "I want to stop watching you from across a room and wondering what it would have been like if we'd met under different circumstances. Because we didn't meet under different circumstances. We met in the worst blizzard in 10 years with a child who wasn't breathing. And somehow that turned into this. And I don't know what to call this, but I know I don't want to leave it." She said the last part, fast, slightly compressed. The way someone says the most honest thing they've said in months, because they've made the decision to stop holding it back and are afraid if they slow down, they'll lose the nerve. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. She looked at his hand on hers. Then she looked at him. "I'm not asking you to decide this morning," he said. "But I want you to know that the offer is real. All of it, the house, the land, the winter, and the spring, and every broke fence and bad arithmetic after that." He paused. "And whatever this is, I'm not afraid of it." She turned her hand over and held his. "I'm not afraid of it either," she said. "I'm just careful." "I know you are," he said. "That's one of the things." She looked at him, startled slightly, and then something happened in her face that he had not seen there before, not quite a smile. Past a smile? The expression of someone who has been guarded for so long, that being seen through the guard is a shock and a relief, and maybe something more than either. They heard Wren's feet hit the floor down the hall. Mara pulled her hand back. She picked up her coffee. She was smiling now, properly, at the table, not at him at the cup, at the fact of Wren's extraordinary ability to arrive at the wrong moment at full volume. "She's going to be impossible about this," Mara said. "She's already impossible," Caleb said. "This won't change the baseline." Wren appeared in the kitchen doorway with her hair at a spectacular angle and her boots on the wrong feet and the expression of someone who has just woken up with strong opinions. "I'm hungry," she announced. "Good morning to you too," Caleb said. She looked at him. She looked at Mara. She looked between them with the unnerving perceptiveness she occasionally deployed without warning. "Were you talking about something?" "We were talking about breakfast," Mara said. Wren considered this. "Biscuits, biscuits." She sat down at the table, apparently satisfied, and the morning continued. Conversation Caleb had been avoiding the one. With the girls happened 4 days later. In the main room, on a Sunday afternoon when the light was coming through the windows at the angle that meant the days were getting longer, which in the mountains is not a subtle thing. It is a specific and welcome fact. He had asked Mara if he could talk to them. She had said yes and given him the room, taking herself to the kitchen on the pretext of something that needed doing there. He sat in his chair. The 3 girls sat across from him, Elsie on the settle, Nora beside her, Wren between them, with her feet not reaching the floor, swinging. He did not know how to start this in a way that was not either too formal or too casual, so he started in the middle, which was where the truth was anyway. "Your aunt and I have been talking about what happens in the spring," he said, "when the road opens." Elsie went still. Nora looked at him with her level, reading attention. Wren stopped swinging her feet. I've asked her to stay, he said. To stay here with all of you. Not just through the winter. Permanently, if she's willing and if you're willing. The room was quiet. Wren said instead of Ruth's. This would be your home, for as long as you want it to be. Wren looked at the tree, which was still standing in the corner, drier now, losing needles, the star still at the top. Then she looked at Caleb. I already thought it was our home, she said. He swallowed. I know, but I wanted to say it out loud. So it was real. Wren nodded as though this were perfectly reasonable adult behavior, and she accepted it. He looked at Nora. Nora was looking at her hands in her lap, then up at him, and her face was doing the complicated internal work it did when she was processing something larger than the ordinary. What about you, he said. I want to stay, Nora said. Quietly, simply, I want to learn the rest of it. The ranch. She looked at him. I want to learn it properly. Then you will, he said. He looked at Elsie. Elsie had been sitting with her hands folded tight in her lap and her back straight and her face in that careful, composed expression, but something in it had been shifting since he started talking, some incremental softening, like ice that has been warming all day and only at the end of the afternoon begins to show the change. Elsie said. She looked at him. I know you've been taking care of them for a long time, he said. I know you've been the one who held things together when there wasn't anyone else. That took something out of you that should not have been taken from someone your age. He paused. I'm not going to tell you to stop being who you are, but I want you to know that here, you don't have to hold everything together. There are other people holding things. You can put some of it down. Elsie's jaw worked. She looked at the wall to his left, at nothing, at the middle distance. She blinked 4 times in fast succession. Then she said, in a voice that was very controlled, Can I ask you something? Do you actually want us here? Not out of... She stopped. Chose different words. Not because it's the right thing to do. Because you actually want it. He looked at her directly. I woke up 3 years ago in a house with nobody in it, and I spent those 3 years letting the house go to pieces because I didn't see the point of keeping it up for one person who didn't plan on being here much longer anyway. He paused. I plan on being here now. That changed when you came through my door in December. All of you. So yes, I actually want it. Elsie's composure broke. Not explosively, it wasn't that kind of girl. It wasn't that kind of breaking. It was quiet, the way her grief had always been, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling. For a moment she looked back down, her eyes were wet, but she did not let it go further than that. Okay, she said. Her voice was rough. Okay. Wren, who had been watching Elsie with concern, immediately climbed across Nora's lap and attached herself to her older sister's arm. Elsie let her. Nora put her hand on Elsie's other arm, briefly once, and then removed it, which was exactly right because it was Nora. Caleb sat and looked at the 3 of them and felt the specific weight of a moment that would not come again, would not need to come again, the moment when something that had been uncertain became simply true. He married Mara on a Saturday in late April. It was not a grand event. There was no money for grand events, and neither of them had the temperament for them. The judge from Gracie Flats came up on horseback. When the road was fully clear, a small sour-faced man named Aldrich, who had performed hundreds of these and treated each one with the professional detachment of someone filing paperwork, which was fine, because what Caleb and Mara needed from the moment was not ceremony, but legality. They stood in the main room with the girls around them, and June Henderson as a witness, who had driven up in her wagon and cried without comment from the beginning, which was her right. The judge read the words. They said what needed to be said. Caleb put a plain band on Mara's finger. It had been Anna's, which he had offered, and which Mara had accepted after a long, quiet moment of understanding what the offer meant, that it was not a replacement but a continuation, that he was not erasing one by placing the other in the same space, that there was room, there had always been room, for more than one love in a life long enough to hold it. Wren was the only one who cried, for reasons entirely her own that she could not fully explain when asked, which made June cry harder. Nora stood beside Caleb through the whole thing with her arms at her sides, and her face doing the careful processing that was uniquely hers. And when Aldrich said the final words, and Caleb and Mara looked at each other, not performing anything, just looking. The look of 2 people who have already done the hard work and are now standing on the other side of it. Nora exhaled. A long, slow breath, the kind you release when something you have been waiting on is finally settled. Elsie shook the judge's hand afterward. The judge looked surprised. She introduced herself with her full name and thanked him for making the drive, and then went to help June with food she'd brought in a basket, which was the most Elsie-appropriate response to an emotional moment that Caleb had ever seen. He looked at Mara across the room. She was watching Elsie with the expression she sometimes wore when she thought nobody was watching her, the expression that lived past practicality and composure, the one that was just love plain and without architecture. She felt him looking. She turned her head. She looked at him. He crossed the room and stood beside her, and she leaned into him slightly, just the weight of a shoulder, and they watched Elsie and Nora and Wren move around the room in the particular way of people who are at home in a space, who move without thinking about where things are, who belong to the place the way the place belongs to them. The adoption took longer. The law was not built for speed, and the county seat was a day's ride, and Aldrich, who had agreed to handle the paperwork, was a man who did things in the order he intended to do them, and not the order anyone else suggested. It took until midsummer 3 trips to the county seat, 2 sets of signed papers, 1 affidavit from June Henderson, confirming what she knew of the girls' circumstances, and a final hearing before a different judge who asked all 3 girls, separately, whether they understood what was being asked and whether they wanted it. Nora went first. She told the judge, yes, she understood, and yes, she wanted it. When he asked why, she thought about it for a moment and said, because the ranch needs me, and I need the ranch. The judge looked at her for a long moment, and then wrote something in his ledger that Caleb was not permitted to see. Wren went second. She told the judge that her name was Wren, and she lived on a ranch and Caleb was her father now. When the judge gently clarified that this was what the proceeding was intended to establish, Wren looked at him as though he was being unnecessarily complicated about something self-evident. I know, she said. I'm just telling you. Elsie went last. She sat in the chair across from the judge and folded her hands in her lap and answered every question precisely and completely. And when the formal questions were finished, the judge looked at her and said, "You're a very composed young woman." Elsie looked at him. "I've had practice," she said. The judge signed the papers. Caleb was in the hallway when Elsie came out. She walked to him with her hands still folded and her face in its composure, and he stood waiting for her to say something or not say something, whatever she needed. She stopped in front of him. She looked up at him, who had managed households in 10-year-old and managed grief and managed 3 years of being the responsible one in a succession of circumstances that should never have required it of her. Then she put her arms around his waist, not dramatically, not with any of the force Wren would have brought to the same gesture. Just quietly, the way Elsie did things, deliberate, decided, chosen. He put his arms around her. He held her the way you hold someone who has not been held enough, which is carefully and without hurry, and without making it into something you need from them. "Okay," she said into his shirt. It was the same word she'd used in the main room in March, when he'd told her he actually wanted them there. The same word with the same weight behind it. "Yeah," he said. Spring on the ranch was not the graceful thing people who have not lived in the mountains imagine it to be. It was mud season first, which was its own category of misery, the yard a trap, the road a negotiation, the barn work twice as hard, because everything that had been manageable under snow was now exposed and in need of attention simultaneously. The south fence was down in 2 places. The east pasture was flooding in the low corner, which confirmed what Mara and Elsie had found in the ledger about the drainage problem that had been bleeding money quietly for years. They worked, all of them. Even Wren had jobs now, real ones, not made-up tasks to keep her busy but actual responsibilities. The chickens first, and then, when it was clear she could handle it, the morning water check for the stock. She took these responsibilities with an earnestness that was occasionally undermined by her tendency to become distracted by whatever else was happening in the yard. But she always came back to the task, and the chickens were healthy, and the stock troughs were never empty, and that was what mattered. Nora became something on that ranch through the spring and summer. He watched it happen the way you watch something grow when you see it every day. You almost miss it because the changes are incremental, and then one morning you look at it, and it is simply larger than it was. And you realize you have been watching the whole time without fully seeing. She was 8 by summer, and she was already a better hand with the cattle than he had been at 12, not because of natural talent, though she had that Because she paid attention the way most people pay attention to only the things that frighten them or excite them. And she paid it to everything equally. She learned the land like she was memorizing it, the way the water moved, and where the ground held and where it didn't, which pastures would support what through which seasons. He gave her a section of the east pasture to manage herself. Not with oversight, not with check-ins. He showed her the parameters, told her what he needed from it by fall, and let her figure out the how. She came to him twice with questions. Both were good questions. He answered them and stayed out of her way. By September, the section was the best managed ground on the property. He did not make a speech about it. He just told her, "One evening in the barn, you did it right." She nodded. "I know," she said, "not arrogant, just accurate." He had the conversation with Mara about the timber rights in May, when the road was solid and the pass was clear and the world had come back to its normal size after the long winter of the ranch being everything. He rode to Gracie Flats and found the mill operator, a large, quiet man named Cass, who had been trying to access timber above the snow line for 2 seasons. They struck a deal over a single meeting, not an easy deal. Cass was not a man who let money go easily, but a fair one, the kind that both men would be able to look at in 5 years without embarrassment. The timber revenue came in the fall. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to purchase 7 head of cattle at the Gracie Flats market in October, which doubled the herd to something approaching the size the land could properly support. Elsie updated the ledger with the new numbers and sat with Caleb at the kitchen table and showed him what the next 3 years looked like, financially, if the conditions held. The numbers were not comfortable, but they were survivable, and survivable was what Caleb had learned to value above all other categories of good. He looked at Elsie's handwriting, in the ledger neat, precise, numbers that were not rounded, and thought about her father, whom he had never met, rounding numbers up because he didn't want to see the real ones. He hoped Elsie's father had gotten to see this, somehow, from wherever the dead go. He hoped he knew his daughter had learned to look at the real numbers and not flinch. He did not say this out loud, but he thought it. Summer and fall brought other things. Bert Henderson died in July quietly, in his sleep, and June sold the farm and moved to live with a daughter in the valley. And before she left, she came up to say goodbye and stood in Caleb's kitchen for an hour, drinking coffee and looking around at the house that had changed and not trying to hide that she was glad about what she saw. She hugged Mara, who did not pull away. She hugged the girls, who tolerated it with varying degrees of grace. She shook Caleb's hand and held it for a moment and said, "You came back to yourself," and he did not argue with it, because it was true. The first Christmas after the marriage was a different thing entirely from the one before. They had the tree up a week before. Nora and Caleb going out to the tree stand in the north section again, with the axe, choosing a different tree this time, taller, with a better shape. Wren decorated it with the accumulated objects of 10 months of ranch life, a piece of braided horsehair, a smooth stone she'd found in the east pasture that she insisted was special, the tinfoil ball from the year before that had been preserved by some miracle of Elsie's organizational instincts, and the ribbons, red and blue, from Mara's travel bag. Elsie found a solution to the problem of decorations that involved cutting shapes from the leather scraps in the barn stars and simple trees and shapes that were not quite identifiable but were clearly made with care, and hanging them from the branches with loops of thread. They were not beautiful in the way of a decorated Christmas tree in a townhouse with purchased ornaments and proper ribbon. They were beautiful in the way of things made by people who had nothing to spare and gave what they had. Carved wooden star went on top. Wren put it there. She did this without discussion or ceremony, simply picked it up from the shelf, where it lived now among Lucy's things, carried it to the tree, looked at Caleb, and he nodded, and she placed it. That was how it would go, every year after. That was the shape the tradition took, not because anyone declared it, but because it simply became true, the way the truest things do not by announcement, but by repetition, by the slow accumulation of the same gesture in the same place until it is part of what the place is. The candle started the same way. He had not planned it. On Christmas Eve, after the girls were in bed, Wren last, requiring the negotiations she always required. This year more elaborate because she was now 5 and had developed stronger opinions about bedtime. He stood at the kitchen window looking out at the pass road, dark and moonlit and cold, the mountain doing what it always did. And he thought about the road. He thought about what the road had held, and what it had taken, and what it had, once, given him. He went to the shelf and found a candle. He put it in the holder and set it on the windowsill that faced the mountain road and lit it. Mara came out of the bedroom and found him standing there, looking at the candle in the window. "For anyone out there," he said, before she could ask. "Anyone who needs a door." She stood beside him and looked at the candle in the window, and the dark road beyond it, and the mountain beyond that, enormous and indifferent and vast, and she did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the candle wasn't already saying more clearly. She put her hand in his. He held it. They stood there for a while, the two of them, while the candle did what candles do, small and specific, and almost nothing against the size of the dark, and still visible for a very long way. This is the thing about grief that nobody tells you when you're in the middle of it, when it has its hands around your throat, and you are absolutely certain that it is the last and permanent truth about your life. Nobody tells you that it doesn't leave. They tell you it gets better, which is both true and misleading, because better is not the right word for what happens. What happens is that the grief stays exactly the same size, and you grow larger around it. You grow large enough that you can carry it and still have room for other things, for work and for people, and for the daily, undramatic business of being alive. The grief does not shrink. You just get bigger. Caleb Rourke did not stop grieving Anna and Lucy. He would grieve them all his life, which he came to understand was not a problem to be solved, but simply the tax on having loved something irreplaceable. The star at the top of the Christmas tree was not a healing, it was an acknowledgement. It said, "This happened, and this mattered, and I will not put it in a box and pretend it didn't, and I will also not let it be the only thing in the room." He had let it be the only thing in the room for 3 years. A blizzard had corrected him. That is also something nobody tells you, that the thing that saves you rarely arrives in a form you would have asked for. It arrives in a storm. It arrives half frozen, with 3 children who need feeding, and a woman who won't accept charity, at 11 minutes past 9 on Christmas Eve, and it pounds on the door with the particular desperations of something that has been trying to reach you for longer than you know. And you have to choose to open the door. The opening is the only part that belongs entirely to you. Caleb had stood with his hand on the bolt for 20 seconds. He had told himself it was wind. It was not wind. He understood now, in the way you understand things that have already happened and been lived through and settled into the body, the understanding that is not insight but simply knowledge, worn smooth from handling that those 20 seconds had been the most important 20 seconds of his life since the storm that ended it. He had nearly kept the door closed. He had nearly let the cold stay outside with everything it carried. He had nearly done to himself the permanent thing he had been edging toward for 3 years. He was grateful. He was not a man who was entirely consistent. In the spring, when Wren was 5 and old enough for the question to mean something, she asked him about the candle in the window. She had seen it on Christmas Eve and remembered it in the particular sticky way. Children remember things that have impressed them. "Why do you put a candle in the window?" she asked. She was following him to the barn, as she did most mornings, slightly behind and off to his left, her boots punching through the crust of March snows. He thought about how to answer this in a way that was true and that a 5-year-old could hold. "Because someone once did the same for us," he said. "The mountain knew we needed a door and put one there. The candle is so. The mountain knows we'll do the same." Wren considered this with her characteristic gravity. "The mountain isn't a person," she said. "No, so it's not really for the mountain." "No," he said. "It's for whoever's out on the road." She thought about this while they walked. When they reached the barn, she stopped and looked up at him. "What if nobody's ever on the road on Christmas Eve? Then the candle just sits there," he said. "And that's fine too." She seemed to accept this. She opened the barn door with both hands and went in, and the horses turned their heads. And Button lifted his nose toward her the way he always did, which was how he said hello. And Wren went to him and put her hand on his nose and said, "Good morning." And the barn smelled the way barns smell in March, which is not a comfortable smell exactly, but is a real one. And the light came in through the east-facing gap above the door. He stood in the doorway and watched her with the horse, and he thought about Lucy. He let out a short, ugly laugh. He thought about her without flinching, the way he could now, the way you can look at something directly when you're no longer afraid of what you'll see there. He thought about her, and he thought about Wren, And he understood, standing in the barn door, in March, with the snow melting off the roof edge in slow drops, that the two things could exist simultaneously without one diminishing the other. That was the thing he had not been able to believe those first 3 years. That the love you carry for the dead does not use up the love you have for the living. They run on different reserves. There is enough. There has always been enough. He was not a man given to large conclusions or sweeping statements about how life works. He was a rancher. He knew how to read land and weather and animals and the arithmetic of survival in hard country. He knew that the mountain did not care about him personally, and that winter came regardless, and that nothing good was ever permanent and nothing terrible was ever final. He knew that he had sat in a dark house with a dead fire on Christmas Eve and had been within 20 seconds of staying there forever. He knew that something had knocked on the door. He knew that he had opened it, and now it was March, and the snow was coming off the roof in slow drops. And inside the house, Mara was making coffee, and Elsie was up early doing something purposeful in the kitchen, and Nora was probably already planning her day's work on the east section, and Wren was saying good morning to a horse Swiss named Button, and the carved wooden star was on the shelf beside a small shoe, and 3 drawings and a red ribbon, waiting for December, when Wren would carry it to the tree and place it at the top where it had always belonged. Some men spend their whole lives building walls. It's what hurts them, and they are good walls, solid walls, walls that hold. But a wall that holds also keeps everything else out, and everything else is most of what makes a life worth the trouble of living it. Caleb Rourke had been a man with good walls. He was not that man anymore. He was something harder to name, and considerably harder to build, a man who had been broken down to the foundation and rebuilt without the walls, open to the weather, living with the grief and the love and the noise and the work and the 3 girls and the woman who had all walked through his door on the worst night of the year and refused, stubbornly and without apology, to leave him alone in the dark. He turned away from the barn door and walked inside. The horses needed feeding. The day was beginning. It was enough.